Hi everyone, it's Professor Fernandez, and I apologize for this morning. Um, the best way to fix something is to turn it off and turn it back on, which is exactly what I did, and now you can hear me. So I apologize for the live stream not working this morning. Everything was set, and of course, as things happen, it's the thing you least expect. So I'm doing this as a live stream because I wanted to do it as a live stream, so it's not going to be as interactive as I hope it would have been. But I am going to teach you this lesson today because doggone it, we will soldier on. So we're soldiering on. So what I'm going to teach you guys today is goal, motivation, conflict. This is not in any of your books. This is something that actually writers use. And I thought that is a good way for students to keep track of stories, especially big stories, big epic stories, to understand the characters and understand the argument a little bit deeper. So I'm going to do a screen share here, and we're going to go through the PowerPoint presentation here. And I'll go ahead, and when I'm done with this live stream of it here, I'll go ahead and put it on D2L. And I will open up a discussion board. So in case you guys have questions on how this works, we can go ahead and do that question and answer situation at the discussion board. So the discussion board won't be for a grade, but it will be there. So if you have any questions about goal, motivation, conflict, because it could be a little like daunting, then I will definitely be there to answer. Okay. And of course, the bird wants to be part of our class, and that's perfectly fine, I guess. Okay, let us share here. Okay, so let's open goal, motivation, conflict here. Okay, so let us start this presentation. So goal, motivation, conflict is looking at the character's goal, motivation, and conflict throughout the story and kind of seeing how that overlaps here, and how that adds to the argument. Writers use it as a way to get to know their characters, but readers can use it as a way to not only keep the characters straight in their heads, but also to understand why characters would do certain things, and why and how that adds to the argument of the piece. So for this particular lesson, you're going to need paper, pen for notes, because you need to, and it just makes it easier. Of course, you will have this video as well. Copy a monstrous, because I think once you understand this, you're going to want to go back and look for things. I think you also have an activity that you look for the goal and motivation for a couple of characters. Markers and blank paper, because actually you can make this into a chart. The chart isn't in the presentation, but if it's easier for you to visualize it, you can actually make a chart of goal, motivation, and conflict, and that may be easier for you. And then you would have had to have already read reading a graphic novel video, or actually have seen it already and done that assignment, and that's going to help you with this presentation. So I want to review what's in our toolbox, because we've learned a lot of things here in the last 5 weeks. Your professor has learned that she needs to turn off her computer and turn on her computer again before doing a live stream. We all live and learn. Look at that. So let's go ahead and look at what's in our toolbox. Oh, my family is so funny. What's in our toolbox? Okay, so we have the rhetorical situation, which is how we look at every type of piece, whether it is fiction or nonfiction or poetry. This is how we look at it, and we want to understand like the context, and we want to understand the writer's purpose, and we want to understand all that thing before we can actually address what the argument is and kind of decipher what it is. It's how we take a deeper dive to things. Then there's the elements of argument. That's what we use for pieces like Letter from Birmingham Jail, and we use that for nonfiction pieces, essays that we read. More specifically, opinion pieces. You want to use elements of argument for opinion pieces because they're trying to persuade you or trying to get you to understand a position. Elements of poetry, use that, of course, for poetry. We don't have a lot of poetry in this 12-week course. In the 16-week course, you would have had more opportunities to practice it. You would have had more. So you have capital punishment. It is an example of us using the elements of poetry. And then you have the elements of fiction. So think of Harrison Bergeron, anything with a narrative. So not only just short stories that we'll read in this course, but you also want to think of Monstrous, which has a narrative. You want to think of movies, you want to think of TV shows, you want to think of web series, anything that has a beginning, middle, and a narrative that tells a story, you want to use the elements of fiction. And today we're going to use goal, motivation, conflict, which is actually going to help us with what we want to know about the characters. Later on, you're going to have the elements of design, and that's going to be another thing in your toolbox that you can use. But that will be next week. All right, so let's review the elements of fiction here, because the story, or this particular graphic novel, we're actually looking at two levels of it. We're looking at the actual story, and we're looking at the design or the artwork. So right now we're evaluating the actual narrative. So character, plot, setting, point of view, and theme are your big elements of fiction. The book actually has additional stuff like the language, which you can consider as well. I like to think of it as 5 elements of fiction that will be that's actually more helpful, and then the other 2 kind of like adjacent. So where you want to use this goal, motivation, conflict is under character here. You want to use it under character. So this is like a subtool of a tool in your toolbox, right? So you're not going to talk about goal, motivation, conflict in Letter to Birmingham Jail, and you're not really going to use it in poetry unless the poem is like a narrative poem. Capital Punishment is kind of a narrative poem. It tells the story, but it doesn't tell the story. A narrative poem tells the story from beginning to end. It's almost like reading, say, Little Red Riding Hood in verse. So that's when you want to use it. You want to use it in fiction, and you want to use goal, motivation, conflict when you're talking about character. Only character. So let's review character. So it's literally who's in the story, and you want to look at primary and secondary characters. The primary characters are the main characters. They have the most screen time on the page, usually have the most screen time on the page. You've already read a story that you can argue successfully, that you can use to argue successfully that this isn't 100% accurate. So that's why I say usually. So it's usually who have the most screen time. Harrison Bergeron didn't have a lot of screen time. He was mentioned or kind of hinted at throughout the story, but didn't have a lot of screen time. Yet you can argue he was a main character because, it's about him. So you can also argue that he's a secondary character because he didn't have a lot of screen time. So it's one of those kind of gray areas, right? I love it when stories fall in the gray areas, and we can talk about it, usually in a face-to-face class, about the rules of secondary and primary characters. So an example of this, other than like Harrison, George and Hazel are primary characters. They've got the most screen time. You learn about the world and what's going on through them. And you have the handicapper general. I cannot speak this morning. That's okay. The handicapper general as a secondary character. And that's pretty cool, even though she is kind of the ruling party in that story. She doesn't get a lot of screen time. You don't really know who she is until she's there, and she serves a specific purpose, like most secondary characters do. Now, when it comes to Monstrous, Lord have mercy. This is an epic story. There's a lot of moving parts to this, which is why we're taking 2 weeks. The first time I taught Monstrous, I made the mistake of only teaching Monstrous for 1 week, and I instantly regretted it the millisecond I started teaching, because there's more to Monstrous than meets the eye. So we're taking 2 weeks to do a dive, and I even think those 2 weeks are not enough. I really could probably teach Monstrous for a whole month, um, and still wouldn't hit everything I wanted to hit. No, I'm not giving you an extra week in the module. We do have to move on to other things. We have the back half of the class that we still have to do. But 2 weeks is a lot of time to look at this in an online class. So there's a lot of moving parts here, because this is really the beginning of a longer story arc. So we are reading like the first chapter, or literally a sliver of the story. We're only reading book one. You are definitely more than welcome to read the rest of the graphic novel and continue on, and you would probably get a better understanding of what's going on in chapter one or book one. And that's great, but just for this class, we're just doing book one. But I think you should read it because it's really good. So like a movie franchise, this continues on. So there's a big narrative arc, and then there's smaller narrative arcs that contribute or parallel to the big narrative arc. So it's almost like Doctor Who, kind of, sort of. This is the Doctor Who with Matt Smith Doctor Who, and the whole arc of like when he was with Amy Pond, and that whole arc of like of River Song, and that whole thing, that whole season there of him dying, spoiler alert, and in quotation marks, dying at the end of that season, and how they started off with the death and they ended with how he got there. So that big whole like epic scene there. So again, like I've said before, 2 levels of storytelling. You have our wonderful visuals, which is really easy to get lost in these visuals. They're very, very well done and very beautiful. And then you have the actual narrative story, which is everything in the bubbles, or everything in the captions, I guess is how the TED Talk put it. You have 2 levels there. So that's why you have to kind of strip away names of characters and names of races or beings. Strip away all of this, and you need to boil it down to its very core. And it's really a story about someone wanting something and the lengths that will go to get it. And everybody has a goal, a motivation toward that goal, and things that are keeping them from that goal. And that leads us to goal, motivation, conflict. So really, we're boiling it down to its very essence when we're doing goal, motivation, conflict. Like, we can add arcanics and kumeyas, we can add characters' names later, but if we understand and boil it down to its very foundations and its roots, we will understand the story better and can understand the argument of it better, right? So before we start, I have a ton of wonderful disclaimers. None of this is in your books. None of it, not one part of this is in Arguing About Literature. My apologies. And this isn't my theory either. I wish I could lay claim and take credit for goal, motivation, conflict, but it is not mine. It is Deborah Dixon. So shout out to Deborah Dixon. She wrote a book called Goal, Motivation, Conflict. If you are a writer and want to write novels and short stories and wonderful things, this is perhaps a theory you may want to invest some time in learning. And I will end it there. So this is, I'm teaching you this to help you keep track of the characters and to understand the argument later on. And this is another disclaimer, goal, motivation, conflict, again, it's only about characters. It's never about any other element of argument. You're not going to use it in an essay like, excuse me, Letters to Birmingham Jail. You're only going to use it in fiction, and you're only going to use it when you talk about characters, and that's it. And you only use this when you have to break down something in a story. Like, use this again as a tool. So let's go through types of characters. We learned about primary and secondary characters, which is a very, very basic way of looking at characters. Now we're going to take a deeper dive here. Let's look at protagonist versus antagonist. The protagonist is the main character. Now, I don't want you to think that the main character is the hero or a hero. let me rephrase that. The hero, not the hero, not a hero, but the hero. Um, there's a different connotation with those words here. The hero, as in, oh, we've been introduced to this person, so this is our main dude or our main dudette here, and this is how we're going to follow the story. Not an actual hero, like they do good things and goodwill to all mankind, because they could be evil for all we know. So I don't want you to think that they are like Superman. They could be Lex Luthor. And we just happen to have attached to them as a reader because that's who's been put in front of us as the protagonist. And even that decision to put a character, whether they are inherently good or evil, as the protagonist of a tale, is part of the argument. We don't start with any other character in Monstrous except Micah. That's it. We start with her. Like, it's her image we see, it's her thoughts we're reading, it's her expression on the face that we are kind of reacting to in that very first scene. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. The protagonist is flawed because nice people are boring. You know, writing a story about nice people is the most boring thing in the world. If you don't believe me, try doing it. It is very, very boring. And the protagonist always has a burden. The antagonists, which I personally as a writer love to write about, they're interesting. They're always in the way of the protagonist getting their goal. Always, always, always. They're always part of the conflict. They aren't necessarily evil. Don't think of it as Lex Luthor. Don't think of it as like the many countless villains in Doctor Who. And yes, this is my second Doctor Who reference for today, so that means it's going to be a great day. Don't think of them that way. They aren't necessarily evil, and they aren't necessarily a person either. It could be a thing. It could be a situation. It could be societal norms. Antagonists are also flawed because people and things are flawed. There's very few things that are perfection in the world. And they always believe they're right. Even when what they're doing is utterly wrong or utterly evil, they think that what they're doing and their reaction to things is the correct thing that is the correct thing to do. So let's start with goal. Goal is pretty simple. It's whatever the characters want, especially the primary or the protagonist character, the character we're introduced to, or the character that's the antagonist, the character we're introduced to. All characters want something. If the character doesn't want something, then there is no story. There's no reason to continue. So the wants could be on many levels. It could be, I want something as simple as an A in this course. That would be like an immediate want, like something that is like attainable, like within the next couple of months or the next couple of weeks. And then the bigger goal, I want to graduate college. That's a bigger goal, and the smaller goal contributes to the bigger goal. It's okay, and again, it is okay to have more than one goal. So then there's motivation. Why do they want this? Why does this character want the thing that they want so badly? And that's massive, because if you can get the motivation, that kind of really ties into the heart of an argument. So if you, for example, are we're doing this example of, oh, I want an A in this course, that's your immediate goal that happens in the next couple of weeks, because I want to graduate, which is your bigger goal, right? I want to graduate or I want to transfer. That's your bigger goal. And the motivation is, I want a good life, or I want a good job when I graduate, or I want to get that promotion, or I don't want to be poor. That's a great motivation for things. So that's how motivation works. You need to think of it as, if they get what they want, what is going to happen? It's never happily ever after. Don't think, oh, and so you graduate and you get a great job and things are happily ever after. No, because things can happen. Layoffs can happen later on. You get into debt, and now, even though you're making all this money, all your money is going to creditors. So it's never happily ever after. You need to think internal and external when you're thinking about motivation. The original Deborah Dixon version of this talks about internal and external goal motivation conflict. I've simplified it a little bit just because you guys aren't doing any writing. You guys are actually looking at character. So I've simplified it and just looked at motivation and goal and conflict in general. But you want to think about internal and external, because maybe the internal motivation of like, um, the supposed character that we're creating here in this example, maybe their internal and external, or their internal conflict or motivation is that I don't want to grow up like my parents did, or I don't want to be poor is an internal motivation as well, or I'm afraid of being poor is actually definitely deeper motivation, or I'm afraid of ending up like a certain person, or I'm afraid that I will be destitute, or I want to live life to the fullest, or those internal things. So why I'm spending some time on this is because there's this is super important. So like the goal is the engine of the character, but the motivation is the engine oil. So you can have the engine all you want, but unless there's motivation kind of greasing that goal, that engine oil, if that doesn't exist, then it's really going to fall flat, right? And there's no way to really understand how that character is functioning with that argument that you're trying to find. um, this motivation can be good or bad. Um, it's not for us to judge whether it is good or bad. It's up to us to figure out what the motivation is. And let's look at conflict. Conflict is fun. It is super fun. What is in their way? Whatever is in their way is the conflict. The conflict could be a person, a place, a thing. It could be themselves, which is a very, very deep, existential way of looking at things sometimes. This story could include that as a conflict. Um, yeah, you wanna like graduate and do well in this class and get an A in the next couple of weeks, but oh my gosh, you have a very bad temper, or which I don't know why why that would be important, but oh my gosh, you're very impatient. Let's change it to that. You're very impatient. That's an internal conflict. That is themselves, the person themselves being a conflict for themselves. So that's an example of that. Conflict is, in addition to the other two, is important because this is where the antagonist and the protagonist meet. What one wants, the other is standing in the way of attaining that goal of the protagonist or of the antagonist. They're always standing in the way. There's that conflict, that head-to-head, that butt-to-butt thing. That's where they're conflicting. So I want to take over the world. And the other one is like, no, you're not taking over the world because I like the world the way it is. And so the battle ensues, right? And so that's where your conflict is coming in. So how this all works, I'm going to do another example of how it works. It's a very simple example. I usually use this example when it comes to goal motivation conflict. Let's talk about a character, and we're going to go ahead and name her Paula. I name her different things. Paula just happened to pop in my head when I did this presentation. We're going to make her our protagonist. We're going to say that she's 18 years old and she lives in Houston, right? That's all we know about her character. We don't know anything else about her character. So let's talk about goal motivation conflict. See, so let's say Paula wants a Frosty. She's been waiting for days, possibly weeks, and she's craving it and she can't take it anymore. Paula wants a Frosty. Very simple goal, right? And the motivation is maybe she's pregnant because she's having these cravings, or maybe she loves Frosties. She's a self-serve fan, right? Maybe the Frosty is a treat for a hard week, and these are all external motivations, right? We can go a little bit deeper and say, maybe the Frosty is a symbol for her, like it's her comfort food, right? She's had a hard week and it's her comfort food. That's more of an internal type of thing. Internal is emotions, things that are going on in your head, right? Things that are like for the self are uncontrollable. And then her conflict could be anything from her car won't start and it's a long walk because it's 2 miles away. 2 miles isn't really a long walk. Well, it is a long walk, but it's doable. And maybe she's just like, I don't want to walk those 2 miles. Maybe it's the 2 miles that's like with the heaviest traffic and there's no way she's going to be able to walk it. Or maybe the frosty machine is broken, because sometimes that happens, guys. And let me tell you, it is a sad, sad day when that happens. Or maybe there's a big storm outside and she's not able to leave the house. So that's what's going on. So Paul is the protagonist, and whatever scenario you choose to be the conflict, that is the antagonist, because they're in the way of Paula getting her frosty. So do you see how the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be a person? It can be the car, or it can be the frosty machine, or it can be the storm that's outside. Maybe you thought of another conflict, and that's keeping her from it. Maybe the reason she's being kept from it is that she has low self-esteem. I don't know. That low self-esteem is the conflict. See how that works? So let's apply this to Little Red Riding Hood. So we applied goal motivation conflict just now with Paula and the Frosty, like a writer would approach it. Now let's approach it how a reader would approach this conflict. Let's use a story that we all know. Let's use Little Red Riding Hood. And we're going to use the version without the huntsman. There's the basic version where like she like escapes, and grandma escapes, and I don't remember, but there's a version without the huntsman. So we're going to use that version, right? And you're gonna do our protagonist as Little Red Riding Hood and our antagonist as the big bad wolf. So let's talk about Little Red Riding Hood. What is her goal? Her goal is to get to grandma's house, because grandma's sick, right? And she needs some soup. So that's the motivation. That's why she's going to grandma's house. You can add that she loves her grandma. She misses her grandma. She wants to see her grandma, blah, blah, blah. That could also be it. The conflict. After she's checking out some flowers and dilly-dallying, because she wants to pick some flowers for her grandma. So I'll pick some flowers to make her feel better. Here comes the big bad wolf. Because had homegirl had just walked to grandma's house, she would have been okay. But no, she needed to pick flowers, bless her little heart. So here comes the wolf. So that's the conflict. The wolf is the conflict. You can say that her procrastination could be the conflict. Look at that. She's like her own worst enemy. And that's kind of deep. But let's, for sake of argument, call the big bad wolf, the antagonist here. And so let's also talk about the big bad wolf's goal motivation conflict. So we know that the wolf is hungry. Man, that Little Red Riding Hood looks tasty, and I am hungry. And then the motivation is that the hunger is so real. I'm hungry. She looks tasty. I want to eat her. That's the goal. The hunger is the actual motivation. And I'm also greedy because I also ate grandma. So I know that I cannot have not just one morsel, but 2 morsels. So greed is also a motivation here. And the conflict, man, that chick is crafty and won't let herself get eaten. I don't know what to do. I want to eat her. She says no. And so that's the conflict. See? That's another reason why I didn't want to use the huntsman, because then the huntsman comes in. I wanted to keep it basic since we are learning it. But if you wanted to incorporate the huntsman, then the huntsman is also a conflict as well. And then you can do the goal motivation conflict of the huntsman. You don't have to do it for a grade. You can do it just for fun or not. It's up to you. All right, this is where we would have had some practice with things. So again, what I'm going to do is put a discussion board on D2L, so that way you guys can put your questions in there, and do the practice that I have at the end of this. So I want to go back to Harrison Bergeron here, because this is the only story that I know that we've all read, because we all had to read it. So I want to do this as an activity. Again, this is again. This is going to be on D2L. There's going to be a discussion board on this. So I would like for you guys to do this, and I will actually write it out there on the discussion board. It's not for a grade. I'm not going to grade this. I'm going to reply to it on the discussion boards, and you can ask questions. So it's a safe space. So don't think that, oh, I have to get this right and I'm going to get graded. No, go ahead and write what you need to write. Ask questions. I will respond to it And so that way you guys can get it, because there is a goal, motivation, conflict activity that is for a grade that is attached to monstrous. And so I want you guys to have practice on this before you guys do that one. So you're going to do one for Harrison Bergeron. You're going to do another one for the handicapper general. And you're going to do a goal, motivation, conflict for both of these characters. One's a protagonist, was an antagonist. I will let you decide which one is which. You can say that the handicapper general is a protagonist, and you can say that Harrison Bergeron is an antagonist, and see how that works. You can actually make the argument for that, and win that argument, actually. How? You know how. I've already taught you how to do that. And so when you are done, go ahead and put that in there in the discussion board, and I'll spend the day looking at it. So let's talk about some takeaways here. Goal and motivation conflict talks about characters and the relationship to each other. This is how you're going to keep it all straight. Now you're probably thinking, oh, I'm still not going to know people's names. Now, if you make a chart to go along with it, this is why you do notes. And this is why I said to do like paper and like markers, because you can make a goal motivation conflict chart. Just put goal, motivation, conflict on the left-hand side. Write the character's name on top and just fill it out. And you can keep these charts as you're going through the story. Because I suspect you'll probably go through it more than once. You probably go through it more than twice, because there's so much there. And it's a very, very layered story. So there's lots of things there to talk about. You can do GMC with secondary characters as well. Their GMCs are going to be a bit simplistic, but it can be done, and it actually may help you understand a little bit about what's going on in the world. But if you wanted just to keep like main characters or just the protagonists and antagonists, because there's more than one, that's fine too. Again, protagonists and antagonists are tied together. And a reminder, the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be a person, and they aren't necessarily evil. I remember that quote that Dr. King said in Letter to Birmingham Jail, that what was being done in Nazi Germany wasn't necessarily illegal. When he was talking about morality versus moral law versus unmoral law, or just law versus unjust law, he said, he talked about, technically, if we're really looking at just the law, what happened in Nazi Germany, it was not illegal. It was completely legal. And so you've got to think about that as well, that the antagonists may be legally correct here, because they rule the world, or they could be not evil, or they could be evil because they're going against the norm. So it depends on how you look at things, right? It's possible for the protagonist to have more than one antagonist. Hint, hint, monstrous may have more than one antagonist. Micah may have more than one person trying to get her. So that's, let me close that out for you. That's, yes. So FYI. So when you're using this to looking at the argument, this is part of like the, when you're doing the rhetorical situation on, say, on monstrous, and actually there's a activity where you're talking about the context, and you're talking about, I think it was context and writer's purpose, right? You're looking at that, and that's part of the rhetorical situation. And you get to the part where you're talking about what is the strategy. That's like the last step where you're looking at the strategy. That's when you pull out elements to fiction, and you pull out goal, motivation, conflict, and you start looking at things deeply. And you're looking at the language, and you're looking at how the story is progressing, and you're looking at characters and their motivations and conflicts and goals, and you're doing all that, right? So FYI. All right, so questions. You can ask questions. You can always email me, because I live on email, in case you haven't noticed, by the quick and swift responses I give you. And sometimes they sound kind of short. It's not because I want to be short. It's just that I have 20 other emails behind you that I've got to answer very quickly. So it's not that I'm short. I just have to answer your questions quickly. So you can always email me, but let's go ahead and keep, at least for this lesson, let's go ahead and keep it on the discussion board, so that way you understand understand. Or you can ask questions and everybody else can read the answers. So we can have an actual legit class discussion. All right. Let's see. If you're still here with me, let me see if I can go back here and stop sharing. Hello. So I don't know if anybody's watching. Oh, it looks like I have 3 viewers. 3 people have found me. Um, so I'm doing this so we can go ahead and record it live, so you can see my face. So hi. I hope this was helpful. Again, I apologize for this morning. Literally all I did was turn off my computer and turn it back on, and then everything magically worked. And then my sister said, "You're an idiot because you should have done that to begin with." And I'm like, "I know, but I've never had to do this before." We will make this work. We are making this work. You guys are doing really, really good jobs. And this is not a course that is, I don't consider this a super easy course, but I don't consider it a super difficult course either. You do have to do some thinking, and you do have to do some pondering and some writing and some rewriting. So you guys are doing really well for this not being a face-to-face course and you having to do some thinking and some analyzing on your own. So I'm very proud of you. You guys are doing a great job. So continue doing a great job. I will go ahead and post this on D12 right now and create the discussion board right now so you guys can have that. And I'll send out an email and put up a news announcement on it. Again, I apologize for this morning. Everything was set. I was so prepared and so happy. I was relatively on time, and then, technology. All right, guys, see you later.